Before I get into today's topic, I would like to give a general content warning, as this video deals with sensitive topics including disease and the passing of a loved one. I will do my best to discuss these topics with the delicacy they deserve, but what I'm sharing today is a personal story that is just loosely connected to a video game. I do not usually discuss these themes on my channel, so I just wanted to give you a general heads up in case you are not in the mood for something that you may find heavy-handed. I assure you that my next video will again be more lighthearted in tone, and I do not blame you if you want to give this one a miss. Back in May, I published a video on the first-person shooter Selaco. In the video, I examined the influences and design choices of the game, contextualizing it within the FPS genre. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend that you do so, as I put a lot of work into it and I'm very satisfied about the result. Despite being an hour long, I did leave out one thing about the game. This thing is by all means a minor detail and irrelevant to the quality of the game. It pertains to a personal experience I've had that somehow made its way into Selaco, and I'll show you where to find it. Near the end of level 3, after the big gauntlet with Juggernaut and right before entering Sal's bar, in an unlit corner in the pouring rain, you can find a tree. It is a tree like all the others in the game, except it has something attached to it. It's a kid's drawing of a few trees with the fitting caption, "We love trees." This drawing was made by me. As a Patreon supporter of the game, one of the perks was being able to make a little illustration in the style of a child's drawing. You can find most of these in the hospital lobby at the very start of the game, where they are indeed contextualized as drawings made by the children of Selaco, but mine ended up on a tree for obvious thematic reasons. Except the drawing doesn't actually say "we love trees", it says "we love trees". Trees is short for Therese, my mother's name. The illustration in the game is based on a drawing I actually made for her as a kid, using the same wordplay. So why recreate a drawing I made for my mother ages ago and have it included in a violent video game? For that we have to go back in time. It's the summer of 2021, and I started to notice that my mother had some trouble speaking. Like, she knew exactly what she wanted to say, but once in a while she just couldn't find a word she needed to express herself with. Now, this in itself was nothing new. Throughout most of my life, she'd been quite clumsy with speech, often messing up words and always mixing up the names of my siblings and I. And as people get older, these things tend to get a little worse. Still, the frequency and severity of these moments seemed to increase at such a rate that I and other people around her took notice, to the point where I could identify it as aphasia. I'd learned of the phenomenon while studying linguistics, and she fit the description to a T. Aphasia is an inability to produce or understand language that previously fell within the speaker's range of ability. It's not so much a disease in itself as it is a symptom of an underlying condition such as a stroke, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, or dementia. So near the end of that year, we started writing the carousel of doctors, neurologists, and even psychiatrists to try and find the cause of these symptoms. If you've ever been in the position where you or a loved one suffered from an unknown affliction, you may know that diagnosing a disease, especially if it's a neurological one, is not so straightforward. I used to think that diagnosis was a simple case of listing all the symptoms and attaching a label to it. Rather, it tends to be the reverse, where you start with a huge range of possible diagnoses and you begin excluding them one by one as more data becomes available. This was the case for us as well. We went from appointment to appointment, department to department, as my mother's situation kept getting worse. One spark of hope I kept clinging to is that for the longest time, her symptoms kept centering around her speech. Our biggest fear was that she was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, but her memory didn't seem to be affected at all. Whenever I'd misplaced my keys, she knew exactly where to find them. She was aware of what was happening around her and didn't seem to struggle remembering things, even if she could come across as being confused or out of sync. At this point, I should also mention that for this period I was living in with her. I'd temporarily moved back in with her in 2020 when the pandemic started, as I could see her struggling with basic things like groceries and appointments. what with all the restrictions. Just when we started moving out of that period, her aforementioned symptoms started, and I gradually became her primary caretaker. When you live with someone, you see them every day, and you don't notice the decline as much as you would otherwise. Combine this with a little bit of denial, I simply wasn't ready for bad news, and I kept hope for over a year, up until December of 2022. A few days after having attended an office party, I started developing a cough. I noticed this while being on voice chat with some friends because within about an hour the cough had gotten so bad that I needed to call it an early night. Turns out I had COVID and so did my mother, although she strangely seemed much less affected by it than me. But the next day I noticed something different. My mother was barely able to speak or even move. It was like she was half asleep the entire day. You can kind of compare it to when someone has just gotten out of an operation and the anesthetics have not worn off entirely. That same day, a doctor confirmed she had a bladder infection and a delirium as well. Most people will know the term delirium from the overconsumption of alcohol, but it also refers to a state someone reaches when they are afflicted by an illness and their body is not powerful enough to keep everything running. In my mother's case, the delirium severely affected her cognitive abilities. From that day on, she lived in the here and now, no longer able to plan ahead or look back for more than a day. Because while she recovered a little bit from her worst state, that delirium was the final puzzle piece her disease needed to get a complete hold of her. From one week to the other, there was no longer any denying that my mother was a woman suffering from dementia. The year that followed, 2023, was probably the worst one of my life. I had to see my mother deteriorate in front of me. As it turns out, she had Lewy body dementia, a relatively aggressive form of dementia that affects the patient both mentally and physically. Within just a year, she went from a troubled but still relatively aware woman to someone who struggled to utter a single coherent sentence and spent most of her waking hours in a wheelchair. I won't bother you with all the details, both for your ease of mind and to protect her dignity, but it suffices to say that, as a son and her full-time caretaker, this was a traumatic experience, and I can still notice its effects on my daily life to this very day. My mother passed away on February the 18th, 2024, 20 minutes before midnight, in my presence. She was in a room of the care home where she'd been residing for the past 3 months after I'd finally had to give up caring for her by myself. Dementia, no matter the form, is grueling both to the ones suffering from the disease and the people around them. For me, one of the most difficult things was that during that final year, I struggled to remember my mother as she was before the disease, who she was when I was younger. A complicated and imperfect woman, sure, but also unique, creative, caring and intelligent. My apartment is still filled with many of her creations, ranging from paintings to lamps to cupboards. She also made teddy bears, and over the years everyone in our family got their own custom teddy bear, tagged with her own made-up brand, Trace Bears, or Trees Bears if you want to go international, I guess. I still have a giant yellow teddy bear with my name sewed on its foot, because seriously, how can you throw that away? I value these things and I want to keep her memory alive, because even during her life, even before her disease, that was always my mother's biggest fear. To be forgotten, or to be discarded as that crazy woman who makes weird little trinkets. I'm not a psychologist nor a family historian, so I couldn't tell you for sure where this sentiment came from, but I suspect it had something to do with a deep-seated fear of rejection as a result of a difficult childhood. In any case, I knew that it was there, and it was so embedded in the depths of her being that when she got sick, it was this sentiment, this fear of abandonment, that began to dominate her mood more than anything, constantly worrying that I would leave and asking when I'd come back when I did leave for the day. But due to her dementia, it was impossible to reassure her in this regard. In my last month as her caretaker, it was impossible for me to even go to the grocery store down the road without coming back to the side of her crying, totally convinced I'd walked out the door forever. One of the few benefits of being the caretaker of someone is that it provides you with a very clear purpose in life. From the moment I woke up, I didn't have to think about what I was going to do that day. At the time, my goal in life was simply to take care of my mother and retain as much life quality for her as was medically possible. On the 7th of November 2023, my mother had to go into a care home as I had been totally burned out by the weight of the caretaking and her situation was still rapidly declining before my eyes. From that day onwards, my purpose in life changed. I still visited her as often as I could, but my role had shifted from the practice of daily care to defending her interests. And since I saw the way that things were going, it was also about defending her memory, as she drifted further and further away from the person she once was. Defending her memory is something I almost mean literally. Like I said earlier, her biggest fear was to be forgotten, and it was up to me to prevent that from happening. So it happened that soon after my mother had moved into the care home, I received a message from the Selaco community manager that I was eligible to submit my drawing to the game. Being in the situation that I was in, I didn't have to think twice about what I was going to submit. Just a tiny little drawing mentioning her name in a way that did not seem intrusive or out of place, nor overly sad. It's a happy drawing, especially if you're completely unaware of the context, like most players will be. Of course, this is not the only thing I did to keep her memory alive. At my mother's funeral, my sister and I gave away some of the teddy bears from my mom's ample collection to those who had come to pay their respects, so they'd have something tangible to remember her by. I also gave a 15-minute speech doing my best to explain who she was and how she would have liked to be remembered. I did this from memory because as a viewer of this channel you may have noticed that I am not the greatest at reading scripts. Regardless, I just find it a cool idea that a tiny part of her lives on in a great video game, one that contains an enormous amount of teddy bears no less. My only regret is that by the time I'd made the drawing, I had no way of making her understand this little tribute, her mind already being too far gone at that point. But still, I hope that when you play Selaco, and you should, you come across this little drawing and think of my mother and her teddy bear emporium, even if it's for just a second. I think she would have liked that. I realize I'm not the only one who's experienced this. There are many people out there who have lived or are currently living through something similar. If you are watching this and you happen to be one of those people, all I can say is that I wish you all the strength and courage to keep fighting. Don't be too hard on yourself and certainly don't hesitate to ask for all the help you can get. Even if the situation may seem hopeless at times, just cling to the idea that one day it'll be over and you can start rebuilding your own life. Anyway, if you've made it this far, I thank you for listening to my story. As I said in the beginning, it's quite a bit different from the stuff I usually make. Making videos in general has proven a great way to keep myself busy and deal with the trauma this experience has caused me, so thanks again for your support.